Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, he rose to prominence a few years back when Jupiter was going through his ascendant and then the sign of his moon. He has been diagnosed with COVID-19, and now he's in intensive care. And just backtracking a little bit, I often see astrology as a system somewhat analogous to criminal cases where the argument is made based on circumstantial evidence. It's very difficult to point directly at something and say, there you go, there's the smoking gun, the something that is incontrovertible. Typically, what you get is information tilting one way or the other. And then you have to decide which way you think something will go. And this doesn't look good to me because, first and foremost, the Neptune transit, and you have to keep in mind, Neptune is a slow mover, so it traveled from Scorpio his whole life, barely a little over a third of a circle maybe. And it's directly square as Mercury. And Mercury in this chart is the ruler of the sun, it's a Gemini, and it rules the 12th. And that's the first big problem. And Neptune is in a fairly long-term transit to this. It's presently exact, square. It will station in the summer in the solstice point roughly at around 21 plus, not far enough away from being less of a problem, and then it backtracks and runs over this Mercury again. So this is the biggest problem. But then we also see Saturn in its entry into Aquarius, the first couple of degrees, is effectively squaring this moon. It's a little past, from half a degree, but it's definitely close enough, and it's in a station. So it's radiating tremendous energy, not of the good kind, as we go into May next month when it will station. And notice Saturn in the birth chart is in the 6th of health, and it's opposite these 12th house planets and square Mars. That is not a helpful Saturn at all when it comes to health, and certainly the transit position is very unhelpful. You might want to say that the Uranus transit around 6 degrees Taurus, since it trines itself in the 12th and sextile Saturn, could be deemed to be helpful, but I'm always suspicious of transits like that because originally these planets are opposed, and so then Uranus brings that energy around as it's circulating, and it's honestly better to not have it in aspect. If it locks into an aspect, even if it's a helpful aspect that appears to be helpful, but it may be adding to the problem. And then we have that, you notice at birth, he has a Neptune-Jupiter opposition cutting across the 2nd 8th, which is quite a dangerous domain. The Jupiter in the 8th all by itself is a pretty big problem. And what's happened here is that Jupiter is due to station in May. It's moving in that direction now, and it's going to be at 27.25 Capricorn. It's not quite at 28 and change where his planets are. Being in a station, that's pretty close, and it's an inconjunct, a quincunx, 150 degree aspect, which is a major health aspect. So none of this is helpful, and I'm going to guess that at minimum Boris has got a bit of a fight on his hands until well into next month, if he can make it that far, because these transits are pretty threatening. If we look at the progressed situation, the key thing that you notice is that the progressed moon is exactly conjunct the natal Neptune. and therefore pretty much exactly opposed the natal Jupiter. So it's triggering that second eighth opposition, which again is not good. There, though, you can argue, well, in a month and a half, in 2 months, it will move forward. So in that sense, perhaps it's not as lethal, but it's certainly dangerous in the near term. And then we also see that the progressed midheaven is pretty close to conjunct the natal Uranus, which is a 12th house planet, and therefore not great either. Going back here for a second to the natal chart, typically you wouldn't look at Chiron as being the kind of thing that would be a deadly influence, but in this case we do have to consider it for two reasons. One is that for three actually, sorry. It's in the health house at 18 Pisces, squares Mercury, and it happens to be a very stationary planet at birth, so it was radiating a lot of strength. And so it's going to be a planet of high magnitude based on that stationary position. And it turns out, at the moment, it's in the 6-degree range, which puts it in inconjunct in this direction to the Uranus in the 12th. So that also isn't great. But perhaps you could treat that one as a short-term trigger as well, because it'll go into next month in higher degrees and leave that exact quincunx. Then we can go over to the solar arcs. And in the solar arcs, we see that the solar arc Uranus is just about to conjoin that moon. And remember, the Uranus comes from the 12th, so that isn't great either. And the solar arc MC is precisely, or pretty much precisely, conjoining the Uranus. Also thought I would mention once again the trans-Neptunian Eris, because it comes from his natal angle here. It's really close to the angle. Of course, it's at 2 o'clock time. This could be up or down a few minutes. I'm always suspicious of times that are a little too exact. But either way, you notice that through solar arc, which is often pretty much the only way you can get any sense of what Eris is doing, because it moves so slowly in transit and in progression, you can just totally ignore it. Here it's 4.5 Gemini. It's pretty close to locking into a square to Saturn. So that also isn't great. And to finish off, just going back to the natal again, it's on a separate topic, but notice that Eris very close to the angle. It's entirely possible that this could have been 12 degrees rising or maybe a little less. Either way, it'll be really close. But this guy is a bit of a discordant figure. He's sort of the Trump of Europe, and Eris becomes pretty descriptive of the way he operates. There's a bit of a chaotic approach to things. There's no clear plan, and it reminds one of Trump a lot. And so it's interesting to see that Eris has that kind of angular potency in this chart. Hopefully he'll get better, but I'm afraid the circumstantial evidence, so to speak, isn't great.